Installing View Composer and managing linked clone VMs. One of the fun parts about taking these computer-based training classes is that when the really long activities need to happen, I can say things like, and when we come back, all this stuff will be finished. In fact, that whole "and we're back" has got to be so, I think, commonplace in all of these video training series that I've put together that it's almost become an inside joke. And we're back. And this time, there's been about 20 or 30 minutes of, well, in the background provisioning virtual machines that's had to happen. I bring this up because, well, in that last nugget, well, we were talking about using full virtual machines. Okay, every time you want to provision a new VM, you've got to go and spin up a new VM. And what's going on under the covers during those periods of time between shutting off the recording and starting up the recording is a lot of dead time, a lot of wasted time, a lot of serial activities that involve copying the entirety of a VMDK file from one place to another. So as you can imagine, this whole deployment of virtual machines and all the approaches associated with deploying virtual machines had to get a little bit easier because, well, if you think about it, you got to go provision 100 virtual machines, and it takes 15 minutes per machine because they're very large. Well, that's just a lot of time. So there is a need and a reason for View Composer. And that need and that reason for View Composer is two things. Number one, it is storage. Number two, it is speed. Right? Just merely provisioning those new virtual machines needs to take less time. So thus, kind of the final phase in the evolution of different approaches for provisioning virtual machines here inside of VMware View is this concept known as linked clone VMs. And we're going to talk about View Composer and how View Composer sort of manages these linked clones. All we're doing here is we're deploying virtual machine snapshots. And those snapshots, the individual snapshots, are executed as if they're virtual machines. So I've got my core VM, that's the VM that everything sort of starts from, and then all the snapshots are the actual objects that users interact with. Now, as you think about it, whenever I take a snapshot of a core virtual machine and then provision it out for use by a user, well, I've got to be able to personalize that snapshot, that virtual machine instance, so that it can be a separate computer than each of the other ones that are surrounding it, and then also its parent. Well, you can do that using sysprep, and in fact, the customization specifications that we used in this last series are essentially a very nice graphical overlay over the top of sysprep. If you recall, back in when we were creating those customization specifications, you could actually ingest in a sysprep script if you had one. Although doing so creates all kinds of challenges, especially if you have a script that's not well understood by either vSphere or View, you can do that. Well, VMware said, all right, this whole sysprep activity, it takes a period of time. And a reasonable portion of the virtual machine delivery and provisioning process is in dealing with all the needs so that sysprep can customize that machine. So VMware created their own quick prep solution. And quick prep is one that it runs much faster. It is specifically tailored for use with linked clone VMs. It doesn't do the SID changing, so consequently there's fewer reboots. And the reason for it is so that when you're provisioning linked clone VMs, that whole provisioning process happens much faster. Now, there's another thing that we have to think about as well when we're thinking about all these snapshots, and that's different kinds of disks that may become required for those snapshots to be usable by our users. Remember how in that last nugget I kind of teased a little bit about, all right, we have to think about the use case for our users. Am I in a shop full of people that just use Microsoft Office? Am I in a call center with people that have one application and only that application, and they don't have any personalization needs because we don't care about them? Well, I've got my knowledge workers on one half and I've got my task workers on another, and the need for personalization also drives the need for different kinds of disks. The persistent disks and the disposable disks, okay, are two different kind of manifestations here inside of VMware View. As you can imagine, a persistent disk sticks around, a disposable disk doesn't. And we'll talk in this nugget a little bit. I'll do more detail a little later on when we start talking about personalization and View Persona Manager. But just be cognizant of the fact that depending on what your use case is, you're going to have some way of injecting in that user's personalization stuff, their profile stuff, into the virtual machine that they get selected to use. And there are mechanisms built within VMware and VMware View to accomplish that. Okay, just be cognizant of that for now. Now here in this nugget, what I want to do is get View Composer installed. Okay, we haven't done that yet. We've been working with View Connection Server, but the View Composer piece is installed right on your vCenter server. Okay, it interfaces directly with vCenter, and its job is to manage, provision, and do all the activities associated with dealing with these snapshots. We have to create, first and foremost, a View Composer database and an ODBC connection. This sounds challenging, but it's actually not. Most of us already have probably a SQL database for, not in every case, but many of us have a SQL database, and doing so inside of SQL, which is what I have here for the demo, easy to do. Then we install View Composer, crazy uninteresting installation. You click done. And then we do some adjustments to the reference virtual machine. So remember how we took the VM and made it a template? We're going to do some other things to it now. And then we're going to create that automated pool with link clone VMs. We're going to take a look at how it works and customizing it with quick prep. And then we're going to do some management tasks. As you can imagine, so I've got all these snapshots now. And the beauty of the snapshots and the very fast provisioning process that those snapshots can enjoy means that I can do things like refreshing them or recomposing them or rebalancing them across the different hosts that I have. All of these are big benefits that I get by making the shift away from full virtual machines and on to link clone VMs. So with all this in mind, let's go ahead and minimize this and actually get that View Composer installed. Here I am once again, vc.company.pri. Take a look at the vSphere client. This is the vSphere server, obviously the vCenter server we've been working with before. There's that little VM-001 that we were working with before. Now, the first thing that View Composer requires is that SQL database. Okay, and to create the database, we do so here inside of SQL Server Management Studio. I'm just going to connect up to the local instance here. The process to create the database, really not that challenging. Right-click and choose New Database. Give it a name. I'll call it View_database. There. I will, under Options, change the recovery model from full to simple, just in this case to ensure that I don't end up filling up log files accidentally. Choose the OK button. That creates the database. Pretty easy, huh? The other thing we have to do is to create a login to the database that we will use. Okay, this login will be different than our VC database user. If you were paying attention to my vSphere 5 series, then we created this VC database user previously. Now what we're going to do is create a View database user. Okay, this will be a SQL Server user. Give it a password. And then get rid of all the password silliness just for now to make things easy, and change the database, the default database, to the View database here. Under user mapping, what we want to do also is for the View database, give this account DB_owner privileges so that it can do whatever it needs to create the database tables and all of that stuff. So there you have it. There's the VC database user and the View database user, and we've got the database set up and ready to go. The next step in this process is to create the ODBC connection for this, so from this server to its database. Okay, just like before, you'll see that system's DSN that we created here under vCenter Server. We're going to create another system DSN here by clicking the Add button. And what we want to do is the SQL Server Native Client 10.0 in my case. And this will be the View database, D-A-T-A-B, if I can spell things this morning. And which server do you want to connect to? Just like before, same server here, vc.company.pri. Right there. Choose the next button. We are going to use SQL Server Authentication. The login ID is View database _user with the password. And choose Next here. Change the default database to View. And next, and then finish. And if everything goes well, we should be able to successfully connect up to that database. All right, so now we have the second system data source, this ODBC connection that we'll be using during the installation of View Composer. Here I've downloaded View Composer. Okay, this is View Composer 2.7. Just literally downloaded it right off of VMware's website. The installation, as I said, is terrifically uninteresting. I point Composer to the database that I need to, make a couple of other settings, and then we're good and off to the races. After we install Composer here, we have to make sure that we go back into the View Connection server and also kind of finish that connection between View Connection and View Composer. We skipped over that process back when we were installing View Connection server because obviously Composer was not available. So let's click the next button here. Choose all through the license agreement stuff. We're going to install it to the default location. And then here is where we enter in that data source name. So for that data source that we created, once again, that data source is going to be the system DSN called view_database. So a view_database. The username that we entered in is going to be view_database_user and then their password. Hit the next button. Change the SOAP port if we want. There are currently no SSL certificates on this machine, so it's going to create a self-signed one. Again, we're going to deal with all of that a little bit later in terms of creating better certificates that are a little more useful. But for now, this SOAP port is just fine. Choose Next again. And finally install, and there you have it, the installation of the View Composer. So really not that much here. Okay, we're installing a couple of services. The View Composer, it just facilitates some of the activities that have to tie into things that vCenter is doing. So there we go with the installation complete. I can hit the Finish button, and as you'll see, that VMware View Composer is going to require a restart of vc.company.pri. So let me go ahead and pause the recording. We'll complete the reboot. When I come back, we'll be over here on the vCon server, where we will complete this installation down here under View Configuration. And we're back. See, I told you you'd be hearing that "and we're back" over and over again during this series. Anyway, here we are back in the vCon server. So vCenter, the vCenter server has completed its reboot. The View Composer stuff is all up there. It's running. It's ready to go. We have one more step that's required here inside of vCon. That's under View Configuration Servers here. And all we really have to do is under the vCenter server is to enable, well, View Composer. Okay, once we enable View Composer, there's one more step down here where we can add in the domains that View Composer actually integrates with. If I choose the Add button here, the full domain name is going to be company.pri, and then I'll just use the same username and password I was using before, gshields, and that password. So there's the domain. If I hit OK, well, this completes that connection between View and vCenter. So with View Composer fully up and operational at this point, we should be ready to start building those linked clone virtual machines. But what's interesting is that one of the things that we had to do to prepare that reference computer for use in the full virtual machines world, we kind of have to pull away from that. Right? Remember how we changed that virtual machine from a regular VM to a template? And the template was kind of the base deployment point from where new virtual machines would be created from. Well, we actually have to go and undo that now because we're working with linked clone VMs. I want to go back up here to the pool. Okay, this is the pool that we created with those full virtual machines. Okay, I'm going to delete this pool just like we did with the manual ones. I'm not going to remove the VMs, but I'm going to delete that pool out of VMware View so it doesn't cause any concerns or itchiness as we do these things we're about to do on the back end. With that pool deleted, I'm going to go back here to vc.company.pri, and we created this VM001, and then over here in VMs and templates, we have that W7 underscore template that's powered off. What I'm going to do is actually power off this virtual machine and delete it. I'm doing this to get rid of the, all of the vestiges of that original settings that we were setting up here. So down here, I'm going to choose to delete from disk. VM001 is now gone off the disk. Once that's done, I can remove the full virtual machines folder as well. I'm just clearing up space here because I don't need to actually have this template in the way that it is. I'm going to right click here and choose Convert to Virtual Machine. Okay, now I'm just bringing this template back into the real world as a real virtual machine because this is one of the requirements for making use of it with linked clones. Now, once that's complete, you see how the little icon changes from the template icon to the real virtual machine icon. The second step that's required with this is to actually create a snapshot of that virtual machine. So here under snapshot, I choose take snapshot, and this will be W7-template-snapshot1. Okay, choose the OK button here. And so now I have that snapshot. So I have a computer. I have a snapshot of the computer, and then from that snapshot is where, sourcing from that snapshot is where View Composer is going to do all its efforts in creating these additional virtual machines in this linked clone pool that we're about to create. So I flip back over here to VMware View Administrator. Okay, all the setup is now done. We've got that reference virtual machine in the state that it needs to be in so that I can create the proper pool. Just like before, I'm going to create an automated pool, but in floating, just like before. But instead of creating a full virtual machines pool, I'm actually going to create a View Composer linked clones pool. Okay, vc.company.pri. All this stuff we're very familiar with at this point. So if I choose next, I've got to give it an ID here. We'll call this linked clones, and copy that down for the display name as well. Same root view folder. For the pool settings, again, I'm going to leave these the same. We've kind of discussed what all these are at this point, and I want to get back to some more specific to this a little bit later. But now we have to make some very interesting decisions about how we want to deal with these virtual machines. So I talked in the beginning of this nugget about disposable disks and more permanent disks that we can create. So as you can imagine, whenever a user is working with any of these virtual machines, these little snapshot machines, that they're going to be creating stuff, right? So user logs into machine, opens up Microsoft Word, starts working on a document. Well, I have to adjust the disk that user can work with, or make a read-writable disk that the user can work with, just so that they can do what they need to do. Now, I have a couple of options here for how I'm going to do that. I can either redirect any of those disposable files. So anytime I try to do a write, I want to redirect that write to a non-persistent disk that I'm going to throw away when the user session ends. Or I can choose to not redirect those disposable files. If I don't do that, then anything that the user does to this virtual machine is going to stick on that virtual machine. And when they log out, the next person that logs in and gets that is going to have and see all the changes that that user made. So you have to think here about, well, do I want those writes to be offloaded onto some throwaway disk, or do I not? If I do throw them off onto a throwaway disk, well, how am I going to capture that user state information so that even though it's a throwaway disk, that the stuff that the user actually needs, part of their profile, is going to get captured in the right way? So this and profiles, I'll say roaming profiles, but I really mean just the management of profiles, kind of go hand in hand. I'm going to redirect those disposable files to a non-persistent disk. This is going to be a 4 gig disk, although it can be much smaller. In fact, I will just make it a little bit smaller here just to make things a little easier. So I'm going to create a 0.5 gig disk here for disposable as the disposable disk. And then now I get the same provisioning settings screen that we saw back in the previous with the full virtual machines mode. Again, I want to create that naming pattern, VM dash and then curly bracket in colon fixed equals 3 and then the end curly bracket there. Okay? So that's my naming pattern. I'm going to create VM-001, 02, 03, whatever. Now what's interesting here is I can create more desktops now because I'm using snapshots. I don't have to provision a whole bunch of disk space to support these virtual machines. I'm just creating little tiny pieces of disk space for these desktops. Okay? I will provision 2 of the 5 as the minimum number of desktops to be provisioned, and 1 spare powered on desktop ready for someone to come in and use it. Okay, choose the next button. Just like before, we're going to choose all those virtual machine settings. In this case, however, I'm choosing the parent virtual machine as opposed to a parent template. Okay, and that's why we did all that work before we got here. Notice here I'm going to select the default image. Here is the snapshot that's associated with that default image. We always want to start this process from a snapshot. Okay, and that's why I named this -S1, so I can attribute it to that snapshot. Put it in a VM folder. Okay, just like before, I'm going to make that my data center, and then the same thing with the host or cluster. I'm going to make this the cluster, and then the resource pool will also be the cluster here, just because it's easy to do things. And we talked earlier about all the needs for creating and separating out hosts, clusters, resource pools, things like that. So down here, you can see I have VM2, which is now available. Now you can imagine too, whenever we're creating these disks, well, I'm creating them in kind of a thin provision format. It's not really thin provisioning, but you can kind of think of it that way. And in their thin provision format, I want to overcommit the storage because not all of the storage is going to get used at the same time. But in the same vein, I don't want to overcommit too much because I never want to run out. So there are these three options here for storage overcommitment that I can choose. Conservative versus moderate versus aggressive. So what do these actually mean? In the none circumstance, there is no storage overcommitment. For conservative, VMware View will actually overcommit 4 times the size of the data store versus 7 times for moderate or 15 times for aggressive. So if you don't think that you're going to have the concurrent operations of all these virtual machines expanding past whatever those multipliers are, well, then you can change it to a more aggressive multiplier. If you think that you're going to have more people that are using more of their disks, well, then you can adjust it down to perhaps closer to conservative. As you can imagine, I put a smaller disk, a smaller disposable disk associated with this virtual machine. And so because those disks are smaller, the odds of them all being more of them being consumed is greater. So I'm going to leave things here at conservative just to make sure that I don't run out of disk space. Here we are under vCenter settings, virtual machine settings here, resource settings here. If I go back here, I now get to the guest customization screen. Now this is different than what we saw before. I can still choose to use a customization specification inside of vCenter or sysprep file. That full virtual machine specification is still available there. And I'm going to get kind of the same place with that, or I can just simply use this quick prep tool. Okay, now the quick prep tool is kind of cool because the amount of time it takes for the entire process to complete, the customization to complete, is much, much lower. Although the amount of input you have into actually customizing that virtual machine is a little less. Now you can add on your own power off script or a post synchronization script. If you do end up like star.vbs, for example, make sure you fully qualify the scripting engine like wscript.exe. Whenever you do actually use quick prep, also make sure that you select the correct Active Directory container for where you want to put those virtual machines. So we created that Active Directory container before. This is our view desktops and then our linked clone desktops right here. Okay, if I choose next here, that's going to go ahead and use that quick prep script to go about provisioning those virtual machines. I hit the finish button and the provisioning process actually begins. So this process should take a little bit less time, right? Quite a bit less time because there's not all that data that needs to be copied. I'm still going to pause the recording for a bit just to make sure everything's all ready to go. When we come back, I'm going to show you Virtual Center over on the vc.company.pri so you can see what those virtual machines look like. And we're back. So here I am on my little client once again, and if I open up the VMware View client, I wanted to kind of give you a feel for what all this looks like, you know, back under the covers after all the activities have completed. So here's that link clone spool that we just created. And if I click the connect button here, it's going to actually connect me up to that Windows computer, and I'll, in a minute here, get access to my desktop. Now what's interesting is you'll notice that we got a little error message that appears. This error message says that Windows attempted to create, or Windows did create a temporary paging file on the computer because of a problem with the page file configuration. So these sorts of errors are associated with how those snapshots get created and ultimately provisioned down to these computers. And so there's going to be, I guess the lesson here is that there's going to be some testing involved to make sure that you can eliminate these little error messages or provide the experience that the Windows clones are expecting to get once you complete creating those clones. Now, this is going to involve some effort in that initial template. This is going to require perhaps some group policy to deploy down to this computer during startup. But all of those activities are those that will ensure that your users end up arriving at their desktop with what is essentially a ready-to-go experience. I also wanted to show you here, if I just log out of this really quickly, I also wanted to show you here over on the vCenter side really what we've done in creating these clones. Okay, you'll notice that we have obviously our two hosts here and our W7 template that we were working with before. And now I have VM-001 and 002, these two computers that are up and operational. I also have this replica computer here, or this replica object that's been created. What's interesting is that the first step in the process of creating a new pool of linked clones requires a copy of the template and the template's snapshot into a new location, or the generation of what we think of as a replica. Let me show you how this looks. Let me come up here to ESX1 and to configuration, and let's browse the data store here on VM2 where these new clones were created. My initial W7-template virtual machine was actually created here on the VM1 data store. So if I take a look here, there's W7-template, there's the, about 33 gigs of space that's associated with that template. Now if I go down here and bring up VM-2, you should notice something. The replica that gets created is a replica that is some portion of that original provision size. So I've got what is effectively here a much smaller, not very small, but still somewhat small copy of that original W7-template. If I go down here to the individual virtual machines, well, you can see that these individual virtual machines are far, far smaller than either the replica or the initial template computer that was created. And all of this is designed in order to reduce the amount of space that exists, so that I have the original machine, I have the replica that becomes essentially the source for the virtual machines that get created, and then ultimately these virtual machines. What's interesting too is that if I look here in this subfolder, the SDD subfolder, I'll find the disposable VMDK that is tagged to that virtual machine. In fact, there'll be one here for VM-001 and one here for VM-002. So again, all of this here to kind of speed up the entire process of provisioning those virtual machines, to reduce the amount of disk space that those virtual machines require in order to get them up and running. What we also have to be careful about are the types of disks that we may use for storing either the template files or the replica files or those virtual machines. You think about it, right? You've learned throughout the entirety of your virtualization knowledge that creating snapshots of virtual machines requires, well, I have to have the snapshot, and then I have to have every other potential snapshot from that location all the way back up to the parent virtual machine. And I've got to step through all those snapshots in order to accomplish really much of anything inside of that virtual machine. So it can be a good idea for you to home the template and or your replica virtual machines on very fast disk. In fact, SSDs are a common storage location for these types of disks because they're so remarkably fast in comparison with regular spinning disks. If I go back here to vCon and we take a look at the dashboard here, I want to click down here under pools. If you recall when we created that pool, all right, I'm going to just click through here so I can get down to the screen that I'm looking for. When we created that pool, the vCenter settings that we created had one item that identified an alternative location where we might include information about, or we might include that disk settings. Okay, hold on a second here. I've got to get us to the point. Can't talk and click buttons at the same time. So once we have that virtual machine identified, okay, here's the virtual machine. I'm going to get the snapshot here in just a second. I'm going to identify the VM folder, which was the root folder here. There's the data center, and then the host or cluster, and then finally after the host or cluster is the resource pool. So once I click through all of these, I get down here to this data store location, and I can select the available data stores that I have for provisioning that virtual machine. I kind of skipped past this purposely when we were creating that initial virtual machine because I didn't want to muddy up the conversation. But you can see down here on the bottom that we have the ability to choose a different data store for housing the View Composer replica disks. This data store has to be highly available because, well, you can't, the snapshots aren't going to function if they can't actually access the replica. It also needs to be a location that is very fast in terms of performance. if I move these disks to a different location, right? If I move the replica disks down into, for example, an SSD, that SSD is going to get attached to by each of the individual linked clones, each of those virtual machines all the time. Every single linked clone is going to have access to that replica disk because, well, that's where the majority of the virtual machine exists. So it's recommended that a high-performance data store and a highly available data store be used for the storage of these disks in order to ensure the best performance for all of your virtual machines. So be very conscious about this. This will ensure, if you put those on high-performing storage, well, this will ensure that you've got the best performance for those VMs. Your users aren't going to complain because you've got too many snapshots that are attempting to connect to one single replica. All that said, well, we have a pool. Okay, we've created that link clone pool, and you've seen that we pretty much, once you complete the link clone pool, that it's accessible for users. I mean, once the status is available so that it's enabled, well, it's ready to go. So, all right, once that pool has been created, well, what can I do with the pool? Same sort of things like you could do with the other pools. I've already attached in the domain user's entitlement here so that the users could talk to it. And again, just like before, I could disable the pool or disable provisioning if I wanted to. There is actually one or three special commands that you can incorporate once you've got View Composer up and running that you can do with these special link clone pools. And these are here under the View Composer button. These three commands are refresh, recompose, and rebalance. And although they don't have the three dots after them, each one of these will bring up a sort of a wizard that will appear for each. And each one is designed to serve a certain purpose. So the first is refresh. Okay, from time to time, Windows machines, they could use a refresh. And in fact, in a virtual environment, refreshing virtual machines is something you want to do, well, as often as you possibly can because, well, when you refresh them, it puts them right back into their original state. And if you assume that, well, either you've made the proper connections so that your user's state data is preserved, or even if you're just throwing away the state data every time someone logs off, well, refreshing that pool essentially flushes all of the virtual machines and then recomposes or rebuilds those virtual machines from the original clone or from the original snapshot that was created. When you do that, you can schedule it here at some point in the future. Maybe I want to set that to 1:15 in the morning instead of 1:15 in the afternoon. Do I want to force users to log off or wait for them to log off? And then once I'm done, well, do I want to schedule the thing to go? When this happens, again, this is a refresh. So what I'm doing is taking my existing environment and taking all of those linked clones out there and making them back to the way they were the very first time I created the pool. Really useful from time to time. Think about, I don't know, you get some kind of virus attack, and there's a virus on a bunch of machines. And, well, in the desktop world, in the physical world, well, you got to go and get the virus off or rebuild all those computers in a very manual way. Here, if you get the virus, I can just rebuild those computers. I can just refresh them, and then that virus is gone because it wasn't on the original template that was created long, long ago. Now, there is some situations, and probably more so the situation where maybe you've got some additional software you have to add into that virtual machine image. Maybe you've got, oh, I don't know, you got to apply some patches. You receive the Microsoft monthly patches. You want to add them into the image. And then once they're into the image, you want to go ahead and reapply those patches out to all those clones. It is this second option here, recompose, that allows you to do that. So let me switch back here over to vc.company.pri for just a second. Let's assume that the monthly patches have come out. Okay, and there's 4 patches we have to apply. And so what I can do is from the snapshot of this virtual machine, I can power on the snapshot of this virtual machine, power on the virtual machine at that snapshot. I can then apply all the patches, add them in, do everything I need to do, reseal the template, doing the same ipconfig release. And then once I'm done, take another snapshot. So if you remember that the original snapshot name associated with this computer was W7-template-S1. Well, let's call this S2. Okay, this is after the monthly patches, and so it's another snapshot that's available for use here with W7-template. So this S2 snapshot has a different configuration than the S1, and all of these virtual machines are currently based off of the S1 version. Well, what Recompose does is it allows me to take the original parent VM, flush all of those virtual machines, and then regenerate them based off of the new snapshot. Okay, a very easy solution for allowing you to automatically update the entirety of your desktop infrastructure by just making a couple of changes here to an individual snapshot. Same sort of scheduling here. I can change that to, for example, 1:20 in the morning instead of 1:20 in the afternoon, force the users to log off or wait for them to log off, and then I'm ready to go. So really, really, really powerful tool here for getting those updates spread out to all of the different computers you may have. The last item in here is rebalance. Now, we talked about, okay, I've got virtual clones, and the virtual clones are sitting on data stores somewhere, vCenter data stores somewhere, and their replicas are sitting on data stores somewhere, and gosh, storage could potentially become a real big bottleneck in overall performance because I've got all these users that are working with their VMs, and every time they do something in the VM, it's got to touch storage. Well, so the rebalance operation is designed to evenly distribute all of those desktops. So all of your little snapshot items across the data stores that are available in the pool. As you can see here, the desktops that are in the available state, those with no schedules or pending cancellations, can be rebalanced. And so what this does is essentially redistributes. It's kind of like DRS for virtual desktops. It redistributes out all of those snapshot files so that they are much more evenly distributed across the storage resources that you have available. Okay, useful tool, again, for ensuring that you've got best performance for associating with your virtual machines. So that's really about it. I mean, the same sort of activities we could do before are available here in this pool. I can take a look at those virtual machines. I've got the right agent version on there. Here's the data store that they've attached to. I do up here have the ability to view some of the View Composer details associated with each virtual machine. So a View Composer is going about performing some action, right? And that action, maybe it takes a period of time. Well, when that action is going about performing, well, I can see what task is being accomplished on those virtual machines, and maybe that gives me the opportunity to do some things with those virtual machines. You can delete enter the virtual machine into maintenance mode. I don't know if you're going to delete the pool here, or disconnect sessions, or log off sessions, or send message, or even roll back that virtual machine if you know that the user's done something really bad with it. Also up here are the currently running tasks. So again, some of those tasks take a period of time. Being able to have a nice list here of which tasks are executing will help you know when situations are going well or not. The last thing up here is the dashboard. And I think I've mentioned this before, but if I haven't, taking a look and watching the desktop status here whenever you're creating new virtual pools can be handy for recognizing if there are any problems going on in the provisioning process. Any of those new machines here are going to show up here under preparing, and so all of the different steps that are involved with those virtual machines, this will show which VMs are in which phase of the preparing activity. Once they're done, they'll either end up down here under problem desktops, and hopefully they don't, or if they've completed successfully, well, they'll be ready for use, provisioned and available. Now, one thing you have to be conscious about whenever you're provisioning these virtual machines is the naming of those virtual machines. Now, if you recall, we were naming them VM-00 and then a number. Well, when you create those virtual machines, one of the activities that View also goes about doing is in creating all of the necessary objects inside of Active Directory. And so without going back to Active Directory users and computers, you're familiar with what that looks like. Be conscious that the names of the virtual machines you intend to create are not already existing in Active Directory, because you might end up with a little error message that the username or the computer name, is already in use. These sorts of items will help you identify here under the desktop status when you've had a problem with the provisioning associated with some sort of error such as that. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've really talked about the whole fun process of installing View Composer and then managing those linked clone VMs. Really, this is, as I mentioned earlier, kind of the biggest evolution, the most evolved of all the different mechanisms for deploying out virtual desktops to users. We started with manual, we went through full virtual machines, and now we've ended up here with these really nice and somewhat handy linked clone virtual machines. We talked a lot about the need and reason for View Composer and how what its job is to ensure that you have good performance of virtual machines while still conserving your available disk space, because storage space in our storage area networks is, well, it can be expensive. We talked about quick prep, which I cannot say, quick prep, and its relation to sysprep, and how those two tools, you can choose sysprep if it's a little bit slower, but it might provide a little bit more granularity, or you can choose quick prep if you want to allow VMware to do most of the work for you. And then we talked a little bit about persistent disks and disposable disks to ensure that the virtual machines have a writable access location so that users can work with them while they're interacting with their virtual machines. And then we down here in the interaction portion went through all the steps involved with creating that database, creating the ODBC connection, installing View Composer, and then generating and working with those linked clone VMs. Coming up next, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the remote protocol, so RDP and PCOIP, that you can use for connecting up your users to those virtual machines, and then also some of the settings you may set. I think you'll find that the two different protocols, at least with this version, there's some interesting differences that you might find pretty worthwhile, worth your efforts and time in determining which one makes most sense for you. But until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.